Hello and a very warm welcome to Political Economy with Shweta Punj. US President Donald Trump's announcement on Wednesday of sweeping tariffs across the world has heightened anxieties and has left nations scrambling to respond. Indian exports have been hit with 27% tariffs, though lowest amongst its Asian peers. The Indian government is assessing the situation. President Trump has said that the tariffs will reverse the economic damage left by the previous administration and put America on the path to a new golden age. Well, what do these tariffs and trade wars imply? Are we looking at a more protectionist United States and a more protectionist world? Would these measures really put the US on the path of golden age? To understand the implications and the enormity of the situation, we have with us Dr. NK Singh, former chairman of the 15th Finance Commission and a senior member of the BJP, a veteran policy maker. Dr. Singh, thank you so much for joining us. If there's somebody who can really put this situation that we find ourselves in at this point, we are amidst the most serious and the most enormous global trade war, and it's you, someone who can put this into perspective for us. I'd like to begin by asking you, Dr. Singh, first of all, a big thank you for joining us. Is India ready to expose its domestic industry to fierce global competition? And according to you, what should India's response to this situation be?
So in my view, I think that India, placed as it is, our response will be measured and calibrated, designed to maximize opportunities. I'm not going into the rationale of these tariffs. That can be debated. But these tariffs now are a reality. And therefore, we need to address the situation to India's best advantage. The fact remains, Sweta, which we know, that leave aside this issue of the recent Trump phenomena. You recall India's own tariff history, that there was a time when India had stratospheric tariffs, very high rates of both tariff and non-tariff restrictions. Yeah. Over time, to make our economy more competitive, we decided to significantly lower our tariff rates. And you recall that three successive prime ministers, and of course finance ministers, did boast that our tariff rates now are aligned with the peer group countries or average Asian rates. If you look at the old speeches, we said that we were approximating average Asian rates. And that was a direction which had commenced from the 80s, continued throughout the 90s. Thereafter, various factors, the global financial crisis played a very important role. The fact that the excess capacity in China began to have far-reaching consequences beyond China to most of the Asian countries which faced this, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia. That actually had prompted us to protect our own interest in not becoming an active member of the RCEP, which we felt would not be a very fair way of allowing India the kind of flexibility in crafting its trade and economic policy structure. But in overall terms, there is no doubt that India's tariff rates were misaligned with average Asian rates, misaligned with the global averages. No doubt, we were in full conformity with our obligations in the WTO, where we had a bound rate. And then, Sweta, if you know, there's an applied rate. We never breached that WTO commitment. So we were within the confines of our international framework on the WTO. But the fact remains that our tariff rates had crept up and our exports were becoming increasingly uncompetitive due to various factors, not only high tariffs, which would really mean that the cost of the imported inputs for very critical exports, does undergo a disadvantage. And I think that uh, in a certain sense, if we are being, it is being suggested that we should look at the entire trade policy structure in a
Yeah.
more holistic way to make India a comparative export destination, both a comparative investment destination and a
Yeah.
comparative export destination to manage, uh, to make trade as an engine of growth. Countries which want to grow at 8% or so, recent contemporary history tells us that it's only countries which have had the advantage of trade acting as an engine of growth that you can achieve an 8% plus rate of growth, which we want to achieve to become a developed economy. We are 47. So we must set this in the Indian context. As far as Trump's action is concerned, President Trump's action, they are no doubt based on his assessment of what the US interest lies. They are, to some extent, an abrogation of the framework of the World Trade Organization.
Yes.
And therefore, Sweta, somewhat surprised that the statement of the DG of the WTO has been a somewhat muted one. And the fact remains that she must be lamenting what is happening, because this really makes the WTO increasingly more and more dysfunctional.
Yes, Dr. Singh, I in fact wanted to ask you about that. What does this imply for the WTO? What does it imply for the global trade order? Because from what we've seen since the tariffs were rolled out, that Japan, Korea and China have said that they're going to work together to come back with a response to President Trump. EU has expressed its, they expressed their unhappiness over Trump tariffs. India has been very measured in its response. So how do we see this whole global trade order, re-emerging post these tariffs?
Well, there are two ways of looking at it, Sweta. One is that we are aware that for a very, very long time, the WTO became an ineffective body. It became an ineffective body because the enforcement arm, which is the dispute resolution mechanism, remained dysfunctional because the US decided not now, but for quite some time, not to nominate its nominees to be part of the US, to be part of the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. Now that robbed the enforcement wing of the WTO. So if countries acted with impunity, there was no way the WTO could settle this in the dispute resolution mechanism. That having been said, the WTO, which was a successor institution to the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, of which we were also one of the founding members. I myself, in the pre-WTO days, from the Commerce Ministry, gone many a time in the negotiations of the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. That was replaced by the WTO. The WTO got off to a very credible start, but the WTO soon became dysfunctional. So that is one dimension we must look at it. What's the future of the WTO and the multilateral trading? Now, the nature was vacuum. So now, in the meantime, preferential trade agreements have come up. And as one of my very good friends, Professor Ann Kruger, who is a well-known trade economist, described the preferential trade agreements as a spaghetti bowl of mutually contradictory policies and coexisted as a spaghetti bowl. Be that as it may, preferential trade agreements have become the order of the day. And all countries are seeking to have bilateral or preferential limited trade agreements to deal with the current situation of how to use trade not in a destructive but in a mutually beneficial way.
So, the bilateral trade agreement that India is negotiating with the United States, Dr. Singh, what are the levers, according to you, that India can accelerate on, and the areas where there is room for us to lower tariffs to make it a more balanced trade agreement?
I don't want to get into the granularity of what the current negotiations are, but the one broad fact which remains is no other market, Sweta, is exhibiting high rates of economic growth coupled with macroeconomic stability and coupled with a large growing market. India, therefore, in a certain sense, is unparalleled. Any country which seeks a market which is unsaturated, with the purchasing power is going up significantly, coupled with structural reforms and the opening up of the increasing opening up for investment as a preferred investment destination, India has huge opportunities which it has to offer. And I think that it is this opportunity which will drive the dynamics of the trade agreement, whose first version we will get in the autumn of this year. We will, of course, undoubtedly lower tariffs on many areas where we think it is not going to hurt our core interest very substantially. As I told you that our tariff rates had crept up and it would be no serious injury to us. There are other areas which we need to tread with caution, particularly the agricultural sector. And on the agricultural sector, we need to balance. There are some agricultural areas where the options may be somewhat easier to exercise. I think, to give an example, walnuts, pistachios, and various other kinds of. But there are these issues of what do you deal with wheat and rice, and how do you restructure your agricultural practices to align itself, even independent, Sweta, leave aside the issue of the Trump. I think that you must have followed the literature on how to align India's agricultural practices to the requirements of global warming and climate change. Prime Minister Modi has repeatedly said that we need to look to changes in what he calls life, which is agricultural practices which is not so energy dependent, and with changing food habits, it is more in consonance with sustainable environment and climate change. So anyway, I think a restructure of India's agricultural approach and inevitably had to undergo changes as consumer preferences also move away from wheat and rice to eating vegetables, fruits, lentils, fisheries, and which are areas which, I mean, for instance, the replacement of millet to as replacement. If millet's productivity goes up, it's less water consumed because the current agricultural practices are too much fossil fuel dependent. What do I mean by fossil fuel dependent? You look at the amount of water which is consumed in the cultivation of rice. How many times, much water does it require? And what does water mean? Water is dependent on use of groundwater aquifers, and you are using energy which is embedded in your agricultural practices. So anyway, the restructuring of India's agriculture was long overdue. And maybe this will give some thoughts and encouragement of how to align not only the global scenario, but to maximize our opportunities in consonance with our shared national objective.
Okay. Dr. Singh, I want to get your thoughts in on the implications of these tariff wars, trade wars on the US economy. And does this imply that going forward from here, the dominance of United States could actually, take a back seat? Could we see the rise of the Asian tigers? Are we looking at a completely, changed economic dynamics shaping the world?
So I think that, Sweta, it's a very good question. The one dominant feature, which is an overarching feature, is uncertainty. Uncertainty of the unknown, but the unknown unknowns, as I have said. We don't know.
Right.
We don't know what the next moves will be. We don't know how other countries would react by way of taking countervailing measures, retaliatory steps, or seeking in some way to try and seek a degree of arrangement which is more coherent and orderly. So we don't know. So the first dominant feature is the uncertainty. So we must not act with a knee-jerk reaction. And as we are doing, we'll calibrate our policies. Now, your question is a deeper question. Namely, that does it mean a restructuring of the post-World War global financial and trade architecture? What does it do to the future of globalization as we have understood in the post-Second World War period? Now, that's all on the drawing board because we do not know what this means to the contemporary understanding of what globalization means, which means basically the efficient value-added chain for global prosperity to the use of maximizing the use of the global commons, as we call it. So issues of environment, and irrespective of whether President Trump believes in environment or not, environmental and issues of fossil fuel are very much a part of the reality we are experiencing itself in multiple ways in India. And I think that in our own interest, India remains committed. Prime Minister has said remains committed to a nationally determined contribution. We are an integral part of the Paris Pact. We have no intentions of quitting the Paris Pact. So I think if we look at this, is certainly, to give you a two-line reply, yes, it means a fundamental restructuring of the post-Second World War global order. And Trump has made it repeatedly clear that this post-Second World War global order has not served the United States well. He believes that the world has got much more out of the United States than the other way around. And therefore, he does not recognize many of these things and want to structure it in what he believes consistent with the objective of MAGA. Now, this is a number of consequences. It means how do you reshape the multilateral development banks, which there is a huge amount of uncertainty. What about the International Monetary Fund? What about the other multilateral development banks, which is an important source of finance and resources for these countries? This is in the ferment. But remember, two things, and I'm sure the US is deeply conscious, or would be conscious. They may or may not care. One is, as I said earlier, nature abhors vacuum. So the US wants its leadership on these issues to be in the retreat. Well, others have an important role to play, including India. India can play an important role and should play an important role as a rising Asian power in filling up this vacuum. There will be other countries which will want to play a more important role. And I think in some way, a new equilibrium will be found. I found, for instance, that a gentleman who came to see me just 5 days ago, from after attending the last meeting of the China Development Forum, Lord Nicholas mentioned that there's a lot of conversation that if the US wants to reduce its exposure to these multilateral institutions. Other countries could play a role of filling up this kind of thing. So, but it does mean that we need to look at the new emerging global order on economics, on financial architecture, and on trade, much of which currently is beset with uncertainty. As I said, India does not be acting with a knee-jerk reaction. We do not believe in doing ham-handed reciprocal action. We need, as a responsible growing power, to calibrate our interest in self-interest to go forward. We need not necessarily trust other countries. Trust is, someone told me jocularly, what trust are you talking about, NK? Trust is a bourgeois concept, only for the elites. What is important is not trust, but mutual interest. And mutuality of interest sometimes bring asymmetric countries together for limited action.
Also, the US is using these tariffs also as a geopolitical tool to achieve their domestic objectives. Dr. Singh, if you could just help us understand that how can the new policies undermine international cooperation and economic interdependence as we have known it, as we have seen it? And we spoke about trust, we spoke about aligning with countries with mutual interests. Do you think now is a good time for India to do a rethink on how it has been working with China the past few years?
Well, I say that yes, that's an issue on the drawing board, but not only India, with many other developing countries of the South,
Right.
with countries of the South, some certainly in Asia, with Indonesia, Vietnam, Prime Minister's recent visit to Thailand, with forging alliances with Japan, and all that, with the Quad remaining a relevant force. With Latin America, large parts of African countries who are, Sweta, going to be much more adversely affected by what is happening to the multilateral financial architecture. I mean, we may be better placed, but having been the co-chair of the forming the multilateral development banks, I realize and I feel deeply, what about large parts of sub-Saharan Africa?
Yeah.
Having spare a thought, they are very, very, very large demography which exists there, who are continuously being neglected and overlooked. I do not know where this current dialogue leaves large parts of Africa as an important part of humanity. So I think it will have to be a multiplicity of responses. I also do not how the current dialogue on the future of the MDBs goes beyond World Bank and IMF. It must include the Asian Development Bank, which has got a large Japanese. Two important banks, AIIB, of which we are an important member in China, and the new development bank also in China, with the African Development Bank. These constellation of multilateral development banks, what's their future? Are they going to engage? They have somewhat a varied shareholder. The most important shareholder, for instance, of the Asian Development Bank is Japan. The African development banks have a different shareholding. So one is this. The second important aspect is the aspect of what about the International Monetary Fund? Leaving aside the development aspects, which is the IBRD or the World Bank and the multilateral development banks, issues of international financial stability is core to the Charter in Article 1 of the International Monetary Fund. How is the International Monetary Fund going to adjust? What about, for instance, the special drawing rights, which is a very important aspect of the IMF, particularly when it comes to address SDRs have been used as a poverty alleviation fund, part of the fund, climate resilience and trust fund of the IMF. what's the future of an entity like the International Monetary Fund? And finally, then on the trade policy. And last but not the least, what kind of economic partnerships are we seeking to forge beyond these issues which are mentioned? And before I end this, I'd say India's own interest. We must introspect, and we are introspecting, how to make India increasingly more and more competitive in terms of comparative advantages. I think that the fact that abundance of labor gives us comparative advantages. We have not even fully harnessed, for instance, our labor-intensive manufacturing, garment, leather, so many of the areas. What kind of changes in laws, rules, regulations, and a different kind of state compact would be necessary to make us a more important export destination. And, but not the least, that as countries inevitably compete for investment, how to make India an important comparative investment destination. All this is necessary as we must strive 8% plus rate over the coming decades to move away from a lower middle income country to a middle income and eventually a developed economy by 2047.
So, before we let you go, just one quick question on the macroeconomic impact of these tariff wars on India. Do you see export-led growth taking a hit? Do we see unemployment rising? Because this is going to have a direct impact on some of our very employment-intensive sectors, such as gems and jewelry. So, what's your sense in the short term, the kind of pain that India could see?
So, let me put it this way to you. Yes, there are issues of leads and lags. I think that Mr. Trump would be sagacious enough to realize that even if imported goods become expensive, the US factories won't come up tomorrow. It will take a little while. In the meantime, the US consumers would be faced with the disadvantage of somewhat higher imported inflation as goods and services are expensive. When it comes to India, a mixed bag. Do not forget the tariffs have been imposed on, let us say, government, but tariffs are steeper in, let us say, in governments, Vietnam, in Bangladesh. So we have that differential advantage, and we should work on areas where differential advantage in labor-intensive manufacturing sector can be used by us, even in the short term, because it will not require massive capital investments to improve our overall productivity and become an important exporter of these items. So I think that we need to rebalance our export basket consistent with the challenges, but also equally the new opportunities.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Singh, for joining us with that perspective. Of course, like you said, there are so many unknowns that India and global economies are working with. More clarity will emerge as time goes by, and hopefully we'll emerge stronger from from the reset button that seems to have been pressed. Thank you so much for watching, and a big thank you to all our viewers for tuning in. Do send us your comments and feedback. Leave your comments in the comment section below. We'll be back next week with the biggest story and a deep dive into that. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.